Okay, welcome everyone to a new episode of the Jeff Nippard podcast. This is the fifth and final installment of the How Hard Should You Train mini-series, and in this one I'm speaking with Greg Nuckols. Of course, similar to the others, we don't only talk about how hard you should train, we also touch on a lot of related topics like the usefulness of RPE, injury risks associated with maxing out, where the low-end intensity threshold for maximizing muscle growth might be, the volume versus intensity debate, and individual differences in ideal rep ranges. Now, as a quick reminder up front, if you're not up on the terminology, RPE just stands for rating of perceived exertion. And as we use it here, it essentially just ranks how hard your set was on a scale of 1 to 10. So an RPE of 10 would mean you reached failure with good form, an RPE 9 means you could have done one more rep, RPE 8 means you could have done 2 more reps, and so on. And as always, I'll have timestamps to all these topics linked down below in case you want to jump around. And after this, I've got a really great interview with physical therapist Dr. Sam Spinelli on posture, pain, and some of the related issues around that. So you guys can stay tuned for that. And without further ado, I give you guys my conversation about how hard we should train with Greg Nuckols. So I want to ask you the question I've been asking everyone lately, which is, how hard is it we should be training in the gym?
All right, so if I sound robotic, almost as if I'm reading off a script, that's because I am. So it really depends on the lifter, the exercise, and what you're hoping to accomplish. And you can look at it kind of from two different perspectives, both how hard should you push each set, and also kind of how much training volume should you be doing. So I'm going to start with the former. For pure hypertrophy training, I think your best bet is generally to be pretty close to failure. So for lifts like squats or deadlifts where form breakdown could cause issues, I think it's worth terminating a set at the point of technical breakdown. For lifts like rows, where you can get way more reps if you allow for the use of momentum, I think it's generally worth terminating a set when you're no longer feeling the movement in the muscles you're specifically trying to target. So, if rows become more biceps and lower back than lats, that's probably when you want to cut it off. Otherwise, I think you should generally be within 2 or so reps of concentric failure. So that's for hypertrophy. For strength work, I think there's value in doing sets near failure so you get comfortable grinding, but I also think there's value in doing a bunch of lower stress sets with 3 or more reps in reserve in order to practice skills and perfect motor patterns. And so kind of which direction you go there is going to largely depend on the lifter's skill, the lift being trained, how far you are from a meet, variations in the individual lifter's capacity to recover from near failure sets, etc. And then, like I said, the other factor for how hard should you train is kind of how much volume should you be doing. And I'm kind of approaching that on a per session basis. So I think that depends very heavily on just the individual lifter's tolerance for volume, but also what type of training they're doing and their exercise selection. So for example, if they're doing those strength-based sets with 3+ reps in reserve, they can probably do way more sets than if they're doing hypertrophy training, doing, say, leg press to failure. As a general rule of thumb, though, I think you can kind of base this on how you feel when you're leaving the gym. So I think you should be fatigued but not completely exhausted after most workouts. And I also think kind of recovery can give you some information about whether you're training hard enough. So I think your muscles in general, kind of painting with a broad brush, should be more or less recovered within about 3 days after your training session. So if your muscles feel totally fresh 1 or 2 days after your training session, you probably should have done more volume unless you're intentionally trying to train with very high frequencies. But if you're still really sore and fatigued 4 days after a workout for the muscles you just trained, I think that generally indicates that volume was probably a little bit too high.
Okay, awesome. That was extremely succinct. I appreciate that answer.
That is as succinct as I can get.
Yeah, that was amazing. There's so much there that I don't know where to launch off this because it was just that clear. Let's talk briefly about let's start with hypertrophy and zoom in on failure, because I think that's ultimately the question that I'm trying to answer here. I think when people think about how hard should you train, it's really how close should you be going to failure and how often should you be doing that. So maybe I'll have you just answer that. I mean, like a little bit more specifically. So you mentioned you need to train pretty hard and pretty close to failure, But can you explain exactly where you should cut that off? And then when should you go all the way to failure, if at all?
I mean, so ultimately, I think it just depends a lot on the individual and how, kind of to use a bro term, how good they are at like feeling the mind muscle connection and what failure means for that individual person. So, for example, if let's say you take a power lifter and you say, we're going to do hypertrophy training, we're going to do some squats, and we're going to try to build your quads. I think that you don't gain that much going all the way to failure because powerlifters don't learn to focus on using their quads when they squat. They squat in a manner that's conducive to lifting the biggest weights possible, you know. Whereas for a bodybuilder who for years, when they squat, that is quad work, and they just simply wouldn't let their technique do something that would take stress off of the quads, then I think, you know, failure for them, or at least technical failure, would be more or less synonymous with when their quads are pretty fatigued for the set. So in a situation like that, for the powerlifter, I'd say probably stop 2 to 3 reps shy. For the bodybuilder, I'd say, you know, either go to failure or like technical failure. And also, it just depends on the lift a lot as well. So, you know, let's take like a strict curl, for example, versus just a barbell curl where you can use momentum. With a strict curl, one, you just simply can't cause that much systemic stress with it. And two, when you fail a rep, it's going to be because your biceps gave out. Whereas if you're doing a barbell curl and you're using a lot of momentum, you very well could be like your biceps may have checked out 5 reps before you actually fail, you know? So I think it just depends very, very heavily on the lifter and the exercise you're talking about. And I think cost has to be considered as well. So one of the primary issues with training to failure is it could potentially cause more systemic stress and take a lot longer to recover from. And so, you know, it might bump your weekly frequency down from 2 to 3 times per week to 1 to 2 times per week. Maybe it limits how much total weekly volume you can do, et cetera. And how much that consideration matters just varies dramatically lift to lift. So, you know, if you're talking about doing skull crushers to failure versus deadlifts to failure, very different animals. With like single joint arm work, I don't know why you wouldn't train to failure, just because like gives you a bigger pump and it's fun, and doing 2 extra reps of, you know, skull crushers isn't going to dramatically impact your weekly training volume. Whereas, you know, those 2 extra reps on deadlifts might really cost you.
I think how you approach that question depends on how much fatigue you think is coming from going to failure versus, say, an RPE of 7 or 8. And it seems like we completely agree on this, that it really does just depend on the exercise. Like, I think the difference between an RPE 7 deadlift and an RPE 10 deadlift is pretty massive when it comes to the fatigue accumulated from that. But that difference on a bicep curl is almost nothing. Like, it's not even on a scale of days for me. Like, it's just a couple minutes and I feel good. I could go to failure again. You know, it's not that hard.
I mean, I can't tell you the last time I did a set of curls not to failure.
Right.
So I don't have any like real world experience on sub failure bicep curls, because just like, why the fuck would you stop shy of failure? It's curls, goddammit, you know?
So like, broadly speaking then, like, I want you to speculate on 2 things. And this may not be a research-based answer because, as far as I can tell, the research is pretty murky in this area. What would be the hypertrophic difference between leaving, say, 2 reps in reserve and 0 reps in reserve, so all the way to failure? And then what would be the fatigue difference between 0 reps in reserve and 2 reps in reserve? Broadly speaking. I mean, like, just have, maybe it's impossible because, I don't know, maybe that's not actually a good question because it does depend so much on the exercise, and I think that too. But I'll have you just kind of pontificate on that.
So, I mean, that's a good question. In terms of how much fatigue is caused by a set to failure, I think it's impossible to divorce the answer to that question from the lifter's background that you're dealing with. So like so I'm speaking to someone who like I got my start with hypertrophy training, then I did powerlifting for a long time, and now I'm just kind of doing like feel good hypertrophy training, just lifting for fun again. And like I can tell you when I started like transitioning back from powerlifting style training, generally leaving quite a few reps in the tank, to going closer to failure, like 1 to 2 sets to failure just absolutely fucked me up. And now it's like kind of no big deal because I'm used to it. And just from training with bodybuilders over the years, like I would see the same thing training with them, especially like if I did like a chest and tries day with a bodybuilder, because I was used to doing a pretty fair amount of benching volume. But they'd be pushing every set to failure, very, very close to failure. And 5 sets in, like I'd be done, like my benching muscles were acclimated to a fair amount of just general volume, but not volume close to failure. Whereas now that would be very, very tolerable for me because I'm more acclimated to it. So I think that I think the answer to how much stress is caused by a set to failure, I think it's the same as any other novel training stimulus. If it's a relatively novel stimulus to you, I think it's going to cause way, way more stress than stopping shy of failure. I think if it's a stimulus that you're relatively accustomed to, it probably will still cause a little bit more stress than stopping shy of failure, but you're no longer dealing with a really, really big difference. And then in terms of the hypertrophic effects of going to failure, staying shy, I mean, I can tell you what the research says, and that's that for untrained people on a set per set basis, the research seems to lean pretty strongly in favor of going to failure being better than leaving several reps in the tank. The research on more trained people who we would probably kind of call in an industry context like intermediate lifters, generally like stopping 2 or 3 reps shy of failure seems to cause about as much hypertrophy on a set to set basis as training to failure would, which on its face would seem to indicate like, why would you ever go to failure? Just always leave a few reps in the tank. The issue with that is the research on untrained lifters pretty much exclusively uses single joint exercises, and the research on more trained lifters pretty much exclusively uses multi-joint exercises. So then that raises the question, like, are we seeing a difference between trained and untrained lifters, or are we seeing a difference between multi-joint and single joint movements? And I could see it either way, really. So I kind of think if you want a research-based answer, leaving a few reps in the tank on compounds and going to failure on single joint exercises seems to comport with the research fairly well. And one of the things I slightly alluded to a second ago is the research to this point really only investigates like novice lifters and kind of intermediate level lifters. It very well could be that for highly advanced lifters who are pretty near kind of their muscular potential, it could be that like on a set to set basis, you need like a fairly exceptional stimulus to accomplish enough to trigger a hypertrophic response, which might necessitate training to failure. I don't know if that's the case or not. There's not research looking at it, but that would strike me as at least a plausible idea. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. I think what the research does show is that like it kind of negates this like old school bro mentality, or like saying that the muscle only knows failure. Like it's like failure is like the thing. It's definitely not the thing, but it could be a factor as like an advanced technique to get you from like, that advanced to that like elite level or whatever. I kind of want to shift to strength a little bit here. And I'm actually really curious your take on the safety aspect of this, if you wouldn't mind just like sharing your thoughts on that. Like, do you think that it's more dangerous? Because there's like all these like, okay, there's these potential upsides of going to failure. Like it might work. The research isn't perfectly clear. You could use it. Like, what would be the downsides? Because a lot of people will say, well, it's okay to do it on like a leg extension or like a, preacher curl or whatever. Like you fail that, it's no big deal. But you shouldn't take, squats, deadlifts, bench presses to failure. What do you think of that stance?
So, I mean, I think I think with bench press, like, I think it's fine. With like squats and deadlifts, though, So I think there are a couple questions. One is what do you mean by failure? And two, again, is just what sort of experience does the person have that you're dealing with? So on kind of like a mechanistic level, one of the things that can increase your risk of muscle strains and soft tissue injuries is acute fatigue. So the research looking at that isn't so much in like a resistance training context. It's more like, in field sports, what are the things that increase your risk of hamstring strains or ACL tears, et cetera? And it seems to be in contexts like that doing things that fatigue the actual musculature a lot can decrease motor control to some degree. And so when you're putting stress through those tissues, like more of the stress is transferred to tendons and ligaments than actual like muscle fibers themselves. Or you tend to see like shifts in like exercise technique or kind of movement strategies that seem to increase the risk of soft tissue injuries. So something like that very well could be at play in a resistance training context as well. Like the muscles start fatiguing, now you start kind of shifting more of the load to tendons and ligaments, and so it acutely increases your risk of strains, of sprains, etc. So something like that very well could be going on, kind of like mechanistically. But I think that again, it's hard to kind of divorce that from someone's training history. So I think that if you wanted to, say, squat and deadlift to failure, and you've never done it before, I wouldn't be surprised if as you start making that transition, you're dealing with some acute increase in risk, just because, you're pushing muscles closer to failure than they're used to going. You're doing reps closer to failure than you're used to doing. Technique breakdown is probably going to be relatively extreme. And so, yeah, that's probably not good. But I think, again, once you get more acclimated to it, risk starts going down again. And I don't think the relative risk would ever be at the same level as stopping shy of failure, but I think you begin to mitigate it pretty substantially. And the other thing I mentioned is just simply what failure looks like for an individual. So you see this most clearly on the deadlift. So if you look at someone like Mike Tuchscherer, when he goes closer to failure on deadlift, or like went closer to failure on deadlift, they all looked the same, like if he'd do an RPE 10 set of deadlifts, the last rep he'd do, he'd grind the shit out of it, but it looked the same as the first rep, just way slower. Other people, on the other hand, like if they did a set of deadlifts to failure, maybe their first 2 reps looked good, and then they looked like a scared cat by their 8th or 9th rep, So just how technique shifts as people get closer and closer to failure varies a lot individual to individual. And also, like, this isn't useful prospective information at all, but I think that there's some retrospective information to be gained just by kind of looking at your training history. And by that, I mean, like, I wouldn't be surprised if some people just, for inherent reasons specific to them, and I'm not going to speculate on what those reasons are. I really don't know. But some people just notice that, like, hey, pretty consistently when I'm training close to failure, like if I'm squatting close to failure, benching close to failure, etc., my back starts nagging me, my hips start nagging me, my shoulders start nagging me. And, if it happens once, maybe it's a fluke. If it happens 5 times in a row when you try training close to failure, I would call that information, Whereas if you have a 10-year training history of training a particular exercise pretty close to failure and it hasn't hurt you yet, I think you can then take that as information to understand that that's a relatively low risk thing for you to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually really useful. What do you, so when you say, okay, on an acute basis, going to failure, maxing out whatever on these even compound lifts, like you're not particularly fearful of that. You're almost saying like it kind of depends on if you're used to that or not. Like if you're really used to submaximal training, then all of a sudden now you're maxing out, you've increased your acute risk of injury. But if you then continue that as like a regular thing, then your body will probably adapt to that, and maybe your risk is not as it lessens over time. Is that right?
I would word that somewhat softer. I would say it is very plausible that you have increased your acute risk. Fair. Like I wouldn't feel 100% comfortable stating that as a fact, but I think that that's pretty likely.
And then what's the link between? I know this is super flaming hot. What's the link between that technique breakdown as a result of going RPE 10 instead of RPE 8 and injury risk? Like I just want your take on this. Because it's like if I'm trying to gain strength right now, and I need to know, like, should I be stopping RPE 8 because I want to still be able to do this in 10 years? Or is it better to just trust my body and do more maxing out, like do this on a more regular basis, and I'll get better results that way. And it's probably just as safe as long as, you're used to. And if you have a bit of deviation in technique, it's probably not anything really to worry about. Like I still, even myself, like I don't really know where to position myself between those two extremes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, I think you're playing a game of tissue tolerance versus tissue adaptation. And like, it's kind of like you're playing a game, like a board game, but you can't actually see where the pieces are moving, and you're just kind of hoping for the best. So, when we're talking about injuries, we're generally talking about like strains, sprains, etc. And specifically like pretty bad injuries, because you might just like strain a pec benching, you're fine in 2 weeks, it doesn't happen again. So at least in terms of like pretty major issues or like chronic issues developing, you're pretty much playing a game where you expose tissues to stress that causes some degree of tissue strain, probably some degree of tissue damage, and pretty much all tissues of your body can try to heal and adapt to whatever stress you put on them. So if the stress you're putting on them is sufficient to cause adaptation, and you're giving your body long enough to kind of heal and develop further such that your soft tissues get thicker, stronger, more resilient, then, ultimately that should have the effect of decreasing injury risk over time. On the other hand, if you're exposing your tissues to strain, and either that's causing enough damage that it can't fully be repaired session to session, or you're just not giving it enough time to repair session to session, then you could start a very slow process of tissue degradation, which, over time could eventually lead to, like, my bicep tendon generally feels fine, and then one day it snaps in half. Generally there's going to be some sort of indication before there's like a catastrophic injury. But I mean, that's ultimately the physiological process going on. Like, you're exposing tissues to stress, and either the stress is sufficient to cause positive adaptation, and that's what's going on, or the stress is excessive and it's gradually weakening those tissues. So I mean, like, that's ultimately what's going on, and I couldn't look at you and I couldn't look at your program and tell you what's going to happen, because it is just a very, very individual thing. Like, there are twin studies on injury risk, and like, if a particular twin seems to be at a fairly high risk of a particular type of injury, the other twin's probably going to get injured, like the same tissue, the same way as well. So I think that one of the issues when having this conversation is that there's just an enormous amount of inter-individual variability, and something that could be quite risky for one person could be entirely benign for someone else. And one of the other issues as well is it's tough to study injuries in the context of resistance training, because like, not that many resistance injuries happen, or at least like pretty major injuries. If you look at research on like incidence rates of injuries in strength sports, they tend to be fairly low. So it's hard to get a large enough sample to kind of see enough injuries to have adequate statistical power to weed out risk factors. So yeah, it's tough to say.
You at least don't seem like comfortable saying that like a regular max out approach is inherently more injurious across the board. Like it just seems to be kind of an open question to you, right? Like,
so I mean, when you're talking about relative risk, you're inherently talking about, or you're generally talking about relative risk for a reference population. And I do think that kind of in a global sense, on average, if you took 10,000 lifters and you said, we're going to train you to failure all the time, and another group of lifters, 10,000 lifters, and said, like, we're going to always keep you 3 reps shy from failure. I think that you would see more injuries in the group that consistently train to failure all the time. So I think that it would kind of in a global sense increase relative risk. But what I'm also saying is, and this would literally never happen, but if it was the most ambitious twin study ever, and it was 10,000 twins in each group, I think that you would start seeing kind of more inter-individual differences in injury risk, where like the vast majority of the people who got injured, like the vast majority of the people who got injured when training really far from failure, I think virtually all of them would get injured training super close to failure. But I don't think you would be seeing that many people who, I mean, I still think for the rest of the cohort, there would still be an increase in relative risk going close to failure, but I don't think that it would be absolutely enormous.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's actually really clarifying. So obviously there's a huge genetic component to whether you're going to get injured or not. I mean, that's what the twin studies seem to show, right? Yeah. I want to switch quickly just to RPE as a tool when it comes to hypertrophy. I think the critics of RPE will say, I think that in a beginner, maybe even intermediate population, people tend to undershoot RPE to the point that maybe it's not the most useful tool. Like maybe just telling them to get in the gym, pick some exercises, train them really hard, and overload on them is better advice than telling them to leave reps in the tank. Just because if you tell them to leave 2 in the tank, they'll end up leaving 4. Would you agree with that criticism of RPE, and how does that differ for advanced people or more advanced people, like more experienced and people who are used to RPE? Do you like RPE? Like I don't know.
I do in concept. So I don't think it's necessarily a fair criticism of RPE that novice lifters might not be particularly good at using it. And the reason I say that is any sort of scale that is based on sort of subjective feedback is generally going to be pretty inaccurate unless you go through an anchoring process. And so what an anchoring process is essentially if you have like a 0 to 10 scale, what a 10 is, like that's maximal exertion. And so to anchor someone, you would have them do a set all the way to failure and say, that was a 10. Now you know what a 10 feels like. And through that anchoring process, then they start getting at least a better idea of like, okay, if that's a 10, I just felt what it felt like to be 1 rep before that. So like that's a 9, a little bit easier. That's an 8. So like, yeah, dude, if you're dealing with a subjective scale and don't anchor it, it's going to suck. But that's kind of the case for all subjective scales. That's not just RPE. So yeah, I think less trained lifters will probably do a pretty decent job with RPE if you do anchor it first. So kind of that's my first thought. For more well-trained lifters, I think the bigger issue is people lacking confidence in their RPE ratings and their actual RPE ratings themselves. So in the research looking at kind of how good of a job experienced lifters do with RPE scales, It seems that as long as they're within 3 or 4 reps from failure, they do a pretty good job of accurately rating their RPEs. What I see kind of more often, I think, is people who are probably doing a pretty decent job rating their RPs who just don't trust their subjective feedback. For whatever reason. I don't know why. I'm not going to try to psychoanalyze them, but like that seems to be like relatively common feedback that I get. And so I think that could kind of inadvertently have negative effects on lifters if you're not just kind of going through your training session like a bull in a china shop, you know the weights you're doing, you know the sets and reps you're doing, and you're just going to attack it versus like you have to think about your RPE on every set. You don't trust your ratings, and you're kind of instilling a little bit of doubt on a set by set basis every time you have to use RPE. I think that applies to a minority of people. I think most people use RPE perfectly well, and have a decent degree of confidence in their ratings. But I think that there are some people who just do a piss poor job of it. And I think that kind of the group that gets forgotten about are people who do a good job at accurately rating their RPs, but just don't have adequate faith in their ratings.
Right. So I'm trying to boil this down to something that's like going to be quite practical. When it comes to your recommendations of how hard to train, I've been noticing that it tends to fall into like one of two camps or maybe some sort of hybrid. For people who like to moderate failure. Like there are some people who like to go all out all the time, but we'll assume I don't think that's you for the most part. So would you prefer to put, say, failure in, like some failure work in every session, but reserve it for, say, like the last set of an exercise or the last set for a given body part? Or do you think it's better to kind of work through a mesocycle and then run a week where you're regularly going to failure, but you reserve that until like the end of a training block or something like that? Like what would be your approach, practically speaking?
I mean, so I think a lot of it just depends on what someone likes. I'm a big believer that people get better results from training programs that they enjoy. And who knows? Maybe there's some sort of like deep connection that like their physiology interacts with like their pleasure hormones, and it's like, you like this because it's good for you. I don't fucking know. I don't think that's the case. Or I think what's way, way more plausible is just that, if someone likes the training they're doing, they are, one, more likely to be consistent with it, and two, more likely just to generally put sufficient effort into their program. And so if someone was just crazy about doing deadlifts to failure, I would put some thought into, well, okay, how are we going to do this sometimes, but not all the time? But, most of the time, like I'm mostly working with people who are primarily interested in strength, who don't just have an obsession with training to failure. And so like if they like going to failure on accessory lifts, they don't want to have to think too hard about it. And it's just like, okay, like I'm doing back raises, I'm just going to get it done. And I like going to failure. Then like I'll just let them train to failure all the time. Because specifically for an exercise like that, or like curls, like I've been mentioning this whole time, I just don't think it matters that much. For strength development, for someone who's kind of more failure agnostic, they don't love it, they don't hate it. I think for me, kind of on a practical level, the thing I care about more than anything is how good are you at maintaining technique and grinding on 1RM attempts, because that's ultimately what they're going to have to do on the platform. And so for a lifter who just isn't good at that particular motor skill for a particular lift, I'm going to have them go closer to failure more often in their programming, just to give them more opportunities to work on that motor skill. Someone who, is, again, pretty failure agnostic, who is good at grinding out heavy attempts, my bias is generally to keep them a little bit further from failure for strength work, just because I think it gives you the opportunity to get in more high quality reps per session and per week, just to further work on improving and mastering the general motor patterns. So that's how I generally approach it. So, based on how good at people are for grinding, that's going to impact how often I put near failure sets in for the main lifts. And then for accessories, like I said, it's just kind of whatever people like.
That's fair. So I don't know if this is the most practical question, but what would you say is the low end threshold for intensity? Like, there doesn't seem to be any major consensus around this question. Like, some people say RP 5, some say 9, 8. I don't know. Like, where would you think it is?
I think it depends how heavy you're training. So, I mean, 2 reps from failure if you're, working at like 85% of your max, like a triple set of 4 at like 85% or so. Like, that's going to be hard, but it's not going to put you under. Whereas if you do a set of 20 rep squats with your 22 rep max, that's a fucking hard set of squats, Like, those are very, very different beasts.
Right.
And so I think it's probably more something like a percentage of the total reps you could do with a particular load. And so I think something like about 70 to 80% of the maximal number of reps you could do with a particular weight is probably what you want to shoot for as a minimum. So, like sets of 6 with an 8 rep max. And I'm talking about hypertrophy here, because for strength development, like doubles with an 8 rep max, that's a perfectly fine set. You're just going to have to do a bunch of them.
Right.
But yeah, for hypertrophy, I think somewhere in the range of like 70 to 80% of the total reps you could do with a particular load is probably a decent starting point.
Right. Okay, great. What would you make of the idea that, well, if you're training for max strength, then you should be, maybe you should be closer to maxing, like you should be closer to failure. Like, do you think there's a case for that from like a specificity perspective?
I mean, so like I said, I think that is important for developing that particular motor skill. If you never go close to failure in training, and if you've never been within 3 reps of failure in your entire training program, good luck with your 3rd attempts on meet day. Right. It's going to be rough.
Yeah.
If someone does generally have that motor skill, though, like, I think they're fine. I don't think they have to go to failure that often. And I think if they did, Boris Shako wouldn't be a successful coach, and he is.
Right.
So, like, yeah, I think that once you get that motor skill, as long as you still go close enough to failure often enough that you don't lose that motor skill, you can do the vast majority of your training pretty sub-maximal for strength work and still be in a pretty good spot.
Okay, so I'm going to finish with more of a conceptual question again, and this is going to relate to hypertrophy. So one thing I've been noticing is people will either really rank intensity or effort as like a very important thing, and they would sacrifice a bit of volume or a bit of frequency to be able to keep intensity very high. Whereas others might say, well, volume is ultimately what's driving your progress forward. So it would be worth it to pull back on the intensity and moderate that a little bit more so that you can accumulate more volume. And that might come as a result of doing a little more frequency. Where do you find yourself between those two extremes?
I mean, I think they're both right. So I think one of the problems generally with people giving advice on the internet is they assume that what works well for them is just kind of generalizably the best way to train. And like that just strikes me as very, very unlikely. Because you do see a lot of anecdotes from both perspectives. So, people who are really into like high intensity training, like Dorian Yates type stuff, Mike Mincer going back a generation, those guys swear up and down that going to failure and like high intensity stuff, a little bit lower volume, that was like the key to building a ton of muscle and unlocking their best physique. And like, I don't think they're lying about it. It very well probably was. And other people just swear up and down that just outrageous volumes, getting in a ton of sets, like that was the key to help them build a ton of muscle. And I also don't think they're lying about it. Like, I think we simply don't know enough about hypertrophy to claim that like a particular training variable is the most important training variable for everyone at all times. And there have only been a handful of studies looking at kind of predictors of whether people will respond better to one style of training versus another. So there was a paper published earlier this year with like lower volume training versus higher volume training on quad growth and whether ribosome biogenesis was a predictor of whether higher training volumes would be good. And what happened, so if this was like a typical study, not looking at, if a particular predictor would, help ascertain if higher volumes were better, it would have just said like, oh, the people doing more sets grew more on average, therefore higher volumes are good. But this study used a within subject unilateral design. So one leg trained with lower volume, one leg trained with higher volume. And what the researchers saw is that in the subjects, and pretty much only in the subjects that had a very robust increase in ribosome biogenesis, the leg assigned to the higher volume condition grew more than the leg assigned to the lower volume condition. Whereas for the subjects who didn't see as robust of an increase, they actually saw pretty similar hypertrophy with higher and lower volume. There was a study by, I'm blanking on the author's name, but it used rugby players, and it was looking at whether acute testosterone to cortisol ratios could predict kind of what an optimal set and rep scheme was for different individuals. It had pretty promising results. Like basically there were 4 programs. One of them was kind of like hypertrophy, like strength endurance type stuff. The other, I think, was like sets of 10. The other was like sets of either 3 or 5. And they found that when they matched people with the training protocol that gave them the best acute testosterone to cortisol response, they didn't actually assess hypertrophy, which wasn't great. They just looked at scale weight, but they also looked at strength. And they found that over like a relatively short period of time, when people trained with the protocol that gave them the best acute testosterone to cortisol response, they gained more weight, which they're hoping was indicative of hypertrophy, and they increased strength more. Whereas when they put them on the protocol that gave them the worst acute testosterone to cortisol response, their weights were generally flat, and generally they either didn't gain strength or lost a little bit of strength. And there were individuals who were sorted into all of those various set rep schemes. There was another paper, I think from 2015, I believe Jones was the lead author, and it was basically looking at whether a genetic algorithm could predict whether people would respond better to like power type training or like strength endurance type training. And it also had pretty eye-catching results. I'm a little bit dubious of that paper because the lead author worked for the company that developed the algorithm. So interpret that as you will. But the point I'm making is there aren't that many studies looking to see if we can predict what kind of set of training variables will be better for certain people. And so I think it is not just plausible. I would be surprised if the same training variable was the most important training variable for everyone. I think that there's a fairly large group of people that grow way better when they train to failure versus stopping shy of failure. And I think that there's a pretty large group of people who grow way better when they stop shy of failure and allow themselves to do way more sets per session, per week, etc. I do think that proximity to failure and overall training volume are probably the 2 most important variables, but I don't think that one or the other is the most important training variable for all people. I think it's a person to person basis, and you just kind of have to troubleshoot and figure out which side of the fence you fall on.
Mm-hmm. There's 2 ways in my head that could play out, because obviously you see people taking all these different approaches and a lot of them are really jacked. So it could be the case that both of these things work and you should pick the one that you like and they're both going to be effective for you. Or it could be the case that there's one that's going to be better for you and you should play around with both and figure out what one works better for you, like on an actual, like, they're actually different things. It's like they could both be equally effective for you, so pick the one you like, or it's, we don't know what one is going to be more effective for you, so you're going to have to experiment yourself and figure it out until, maybe some of these other predictors become legitimized. But as of now, that's the best we've got, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at.
Right. Gotcha.
Oh, I also think ideal rep range is like super individual. So I mean, like when you came on the Stronger by Science podcast, we talked about Jeff Willett a little bit. I remember that. And like Willett and the whole Max OT crowd, and now like these days Martin Burkhan and kind of his disciples all swear by what would generally be considered relatively low rep stuff, at least in the context of bodybuilding, but also like generally pushing very, very close to failure or to failure. But generally in like lower rep ranges than would often be recommended for bodybuilding. And then you have then you have just like an entire history of people, including like people who are generally well regarded in the industry nowadays, like Dan John and Stan Efferding, who just swear by 20 rep squats for putting on leg mass, and not that many sets of them, but like high rep shit, fuck you up, 1 or 2 sets, you're done, And so, yeah, I think that like rep range and intensity is another variable that like different people respond better to heavier versus lighter stuff. Now, I don't think that like the ideal rep range is like doubles for anyone. I wish it was. That would be great.
Yeah.
But, I think that some people will find that they grow best with sets of kind of like 5 to 8, kind of like the heavier, lower rep end of kind of the stretched version of the hypertrophy range. I think a lot of people do generally grow well with like the standard 8 to 12. I think there's a reason that recommendation has stood the test of time. And then I think other people do find that they grow best with kind of sets of 12, 15, 20 plus reps. So yeah, I mean, one of the issues with how people interpret science is that they forget that in 98% of the studies out there, you're simply comparing group averages, like what works on average better or worse than something else. Which isn't all that informative about what mix of variables will give the best results for an individual. Right. It gives you a good starting point, but I think that there's a ton of just general troubleshooting that lifters should do for themselves.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I like that answer. That was fantastic. I think I'm going to leave it there. I think we actually covered a lot of ground. This is an area that I just find really interesting because it actually does seem consequential. It's like, it seems to matter how hard you should train and how close you should push sets to failure. And there doesn't like seem to be any real consensus on this topic. So it's like been really interesting for me to hear all these different opinions. And it's like, from a public communication perspective, it's actually kind of hard to boil it down. I say that to say, I think it's been like kind of grounding to speak to you on this, because it does go to show that like there is some truth on both ends of the spectrum here.
I mean, I could be completely full of shit. I have the character flaw of trusting people when they tell me things. Right. And if someone tells me, hey, I used to do a ton of volume, I cut my weekly sets by 3/4 and I pushed to failure now and started growing a lot, I have no reason to think they're lying to me,
Yeah. And then it becomes difficult to just like tease out causation with those anecdotes. It's like, it feels like when you're listening to someone, it's like, well, that could be because you did this thing or that thing. It's really hard to distill it down, and that's where the research comes in. But then with that, you have the issue of not being able to detect inter-individual differences as well. So it just becomes an inherently difficult question to answer.
I think people just want to know things, and like, I think that's boring, If I know something with like 99% confidence, that is infuriating, because then it's like, well, that's a line of inquiry that I used to enjoy that's no longer interesting to me. Right. You know what I mean? So I like to leave things open-ended as long as I can possibly justify to.
Awesome. Well, Greg, I really appreciate your time, man. It's been great having you back on. And
yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, man.